Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Evening had fallen over Manhattan, enveloping the skyscrapers in a golden veil that headlights and neon lights were beginning to tear apart. In an upscale restaurant on Fifth Avenue, Richard Coleman, a respected multimillionaire and real estate mogul, was preparing to go out with his only son, 12-year-old Ethan. Ethan, who has autism, didn't react like other children. While Richard talked business on the phone, the boy stared at the streetlights, fascinated, his eyes shining as if he saw a world invisible to others. When Richard finally put away his phone and took his son's hand, the latter gently removed it and began walking toward a busy intersection. Richard, annoyed but attentive, followed closely behind. That's when they saw him, a man with a weathered face, wearing a worn coat, playing a melody on a battered old guitar. His fingers trembled slightly, but his raspy voice had something surprisingly soothing about it. At his feet, a cardboard box served as a container for a few coins. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. Without hesitation, he walked towards the stranger and, under his father's incredulous gaze, he began to dance awkwardly, following the rhythm of the song. His movements were disordered, but his face radiated a disarming sincerity. The beggar, surprised, smiled. His tired eyes regained a forgotten glow. Spontaneously, he accompanied the child's dance with softer, more lively chords, as if he wanted to encourage him. Richard felt his heart sink. He had never seen his son open up to the outside world like this. The child who refused to be touched, who couldn't stand crowds, was now dancing among passers-by who stopped to watch, some clapping, others filming the scene. But it was when he looked at the beggar's face that Richard felt a cold shock run through his body. His features, his eyes, he knew them. A distant memory, one he thought buried, had suddenly resurfaced. In a matter of seconds, everything around him collapsed. This man wasn't just another stranger. No. He was the man who saved his life almost 20 years ago. And there he stood, forgotten by all, reduced to the streets, while he, Richard Coleman, sat at the pinnacle of success. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, unable to look away. His son, Ethan, continued to spin around, his arms outstretched as if trying to capture the music. Passers-by had gathered around, some smiling, others taking videos. To them, it was simply a touching scene. But to Richard, it was much more than just a street performance. His heart was pounding. The man's face, marked by fatigue and poverty, came back to him like a memory. The deep wrinkles and unkempt beard were not enough to mask that look. That look he had seen only once in his life, but which had etched itself in his memory like an indelible burn. One night, 20 years earlier, when he was still just an arrogant and carefree student, Richard had almost died. A car accident, pouring rain, a metal carcass ready to explode. And this man, younger, stronger at the time, had risked his life to pull him from the flames. Richard had sworn to himself he would never forget that rescue, and yet, absorbed in his race for success, he had never sought to know what had become of his savior. Until tonight. The beggar looked up at him briefly. Their eyes met, and Richard saw a fleeting glimmer of recognition in his dark pupils. But the man immediately looked away, as if refusing to reopen an old wound. "Dad! Look! I'm dancing!" Ethan called out with a rare joy in his voice. Richard felt his eyes mist over. His son, so often locked in his own world, was finally opening up to someone, and that someone was precisely the man to whom he owed his own life. Caught between emotion and shame, Richard felt a nagging question tear at him. How could he let a hero end up in misery? At that precise moment, he understood that this encounter was no accident. It was a brutal reminder of the past, an unpaid debt knocking at his door. Richard took a deep breath. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to move forward. The passers-by were slowly dispersing, the small stage losing its luster now that Ethan's dancing was running out of steam. The boy, exhausted but smiling, sat down on the sidewalk next to the musician, as if he had found a natural refuge with him. The multimillionaire approached slowly. Each step felt like a ton. When he finally reached the man, he felt his words catch in his throat. How could he approach the man he had never thanked? The man he had forgotten for 2 decades? "Sir," he murmured in a hesitant voice. The beggar barely looked up. He continued to stroke the strings of his guitar, as if to protect himself behind the music. "You don't remember me, do you?" Richard said breathlessly. A heavy silence fell. Then, in a hoarse tone, the man replied. "We rarely remember strangers on the street. But I remember you." This sentence hit Richard like a slap in the face. Yes, he had let himself be swept away by his career, his empire, his fortune. But this man, despite the poverty, despite the years, had kept his memory. "You saved my life," Richard said, his voice breaking. "It was raining. I was stuck in that car. You got me out." The man nodded slowly. His eyes clouded with a deep melancholy. "Yes. And I remember you running, injured but alive, without even a word." Shame overwhelmed Richard. His whole body burned with the weight of this truth. He knelt almost in spite of himself, placing a hand on the beggar's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I never looked for you. I owe you my life, and yet I forgot you." The musician slowly pulled away, resuming his guitar playing. Ethan, meanwhile, placed his hands on the strings, laughing softly, as if he wanted to participate in the melody. The beggar's gaze softened slightly at the sight of the child. Then, staring at Richard, he said in a deep voice, "Your son has something money can't buy. He sees beyond appearances. You should learn from him." These words pierced Richard deeper than any accusation. And in the silence that followed, he understood that this meeting was only the beginning of a much greater truth. As evening drew on, New York traffic resumed its usual din. Richard still stood facing the beggar, torn between admiration, guilt, and curiosity. Ethan, sitting cross-legged, continued to clap his hands gently, creating a chaotic rhythm that the man with the guitar followed with astonishing patience. Richard took a breath and dared. "Tell me, how did you get here?" The man remained silent, his gaze lost in space. His fingers continued to strum the strings, but this time the music was heavy, almost painful. After a long moment, he breathed. "Life wasn't always like this. I had a home. A family. A stable job. Then, one day, everything fell apart." His eyes clouded with painful memories. "After that accident where I pulled you out of your car, I suffered a severe burn on my leg. I couldn't work for months. My employer abandoned me. The bills were piling up, and my wife, she had enough. She left with our daughter." He paused, swallowing hard. "I tried to bounce back, but when you lose your home and your family, you also lose a part of yourself. So I fell into alcoholism, then the street. The guitar was the only thing that kept me from completely destroying myself." Each word resonated like a hammer blow to Richard's heart. He realized that the man before him was not only his savior, but also the victim of a chain of injustices and misfortunes. Ethan, who was listening attentively despite his apparent distraction, placed his hand on the musician's knee and said in a soft voice, "You make beautiful music." The man's gaze clouded. For the first time since the conversation began, he truly smiled, a fragile, almost forgotten smile. Richard felt his eyes mist over. His son had just said what he hadn't been able to express. Where he saw a burden from the past, Ethan simply saw a man worthy of admiration. At that moment, Richard made an inner decision: he could not turn his back a second time. Richard ran a nervous hand through his hair, glancing around. Passers-by were becoming fewer as the night wore on, but the cold Manhattan air still stung their faces. Ethan, however, remained seated near the musician, as if he had found a new playmate. "Listen," Richard said sincerely, "I want to help you. You can't go on living like this. I can find you a place to live, a job. I can get you off the streets." The beggar slowly raised his head. His eyes shone with a mixture of defiance and pain. "Why now?" he asked, his voice cracking but firm. "I've been living in the shadows for 20 years. I've been fighting alone for 20 years. And now Mr. Millionaire comes down from his ivory tower to offer me his hand?" Richard looked down, struck by the stark truth. "I know. I abandoned you. I didn't try to find out what happened to you. But today, I want to make up for my mistakes." The musician sneered bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you can erase 2 decades of suffering with a check? Pride, Mr. Coleman, is all I have left. You can't buy it from me." These words struck Richard right in the heart. He, who had believed that his money could solve everything, found himself helpless. For the first time in a long time, he felt helpless. Ethan, who was watching the scene, gently tugged the beggar's sleeve. "You could come home," he said simply. "You could play guitar for me." Silence fell. The musician stared at the child, then at Richard. His lips trembled, but no words came out. He finally looked away, clutching his guitar like a shield. "Promises. I don't believe in them anymore." Richard realized then that gaining this man's trust would be much harder than he'd imagined. But seeing his son's bright eyes, he knew he had no right to back down. The next morning, Richard couldn't concentrate. In his office at the top of the Coleman Tower, files piled up, calls from his associates poured in, but his mind remained fixed on that street-scarred face and those bitter words. The night before, he had barely slept. Ethan, on the other hand, had fallen asleep with a rare smile, repeating over and over, "He plays beautiful music." These simple words carried more weight than any investor advice. At noon, Richard made an unusual decision. He cancelled all his meetings. His assistants were baffled. Their boss never missed a meeting, let alone an important negotiation. But he had only one thought: to return to that place, to find the man he had left behind a second time. He took his car and drove down Fifth Avenue. The sidewalk where the meeting had taken place was almost empty. For a moment, a dull anxiety gripped him. What if he was gone? What if he never saw him again? But a few meters further on, near a vending machine, Richard spotted the familiar figure. The beggar was sitting on the ground, his guitar lying beside him, his head bowed, as if asleep. Richard approached. This time, he wasn't in an impeccable suit. He had put on a simple, almost discreet coat, so as not to look like the arrogant tycoon he saw in the newspapers. "Hello," he said softly. The musician raised his head in surprise. His eyes narrowed. You came back?" "Yes. And I'll come back again. I don't want you to think it was a whim." The beggar gave a bitter smile. The rich never return to the same place twice. Richard sat down next to him on the sidewalk, ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. "So I'm not like the others," he said calmly. A silence fell. Then the musician, a little unsettled by this unexpected gesture, picked up his guitar again and began to play. A soft, melancholic melody, yet full of sincerity. Richard listened wordlessly, his eyes moist. Each note sounded like a confession, a story told without words. And he knew he would do anything to help this man regain his lost dignity. As the last note sounded, Richard softly cleared his throat. "At least let me treat you to a hot meal. No strings attached, no promises. Just a meal." The musician shook his head, a bitter smirk on his lips. "Pity is worse than hunger." "It's not pity," Richard replied calmly. "It's my way of saying thank you." The beggar clutched his guitar, his eyes blazing with suppressed anger. "If you really knew what I'm wearing, you wouldn't be here talking about thank you." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" The man looked away, his jaw clenched. After a long silence, he said in a raspy breath, "I made mistakes, big mistakes. I lost more than my family, more than my home. There are things I can't undo." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He'd expected to hear talk of poverty, injustice, maybe addiction. But the somber tone hid something deeper, a buried secret that went beyond simple bad luck. Whatever it is, he said firmly, you don't deserve to die in the street. The musician fixed his gaze on hers, a gaze both hard and desperate. You don't understand. Everyone eventually walks away. Even those who say they want to help. When they find out, they leave. Richard remained silent, shaken by these words. Ethan, who was holding his father's hand, approached the musician and said in a soft voice, I won't leave. The man's face cracked. For the first time, his shell of suspicion wavered. His lips trembled, and his eyes filled with an emotion he was trying to hold back. Richard realized then that if he wanted to unravel this mystery, he would first have to gain the trust of this wounded man. And that this secret, whatever it was, risked upsetting far more than his own conscience. Evening was falling over the city again when Richard stood up, determined. His business instincts still dictated caution, but this time he listened to another voice, his son's. Come with us, he said, his tone firmer than he expected. Not tomorrow, not later. Tonight. The musician jumped, as if he had just been slapped. His hands nervously gripped the neck of his guitar. At your place? In your glass palace? I have no business being there. Ethan, clinging to the man's arm, insisted in a soft but determined voice. You can play for me. Mom said music helps you sleep. The musician's gaze fell on the child, and Richard noticed a hint of hesitation. His son, with disarming innocence, had broken down a barrier that his own money had failed to shake. Richard N. Profita. It's not a matter of charity. You wouldn't be my guest, but Ethan's. A heavy silence fell. Then, slowly, the man sighed and nodded. Just for tonight. The drive to the Coleman mansion was almost surreal. Sitting in the back of the sedan, the musician, whose name Richard still hadn't asked, watched the city lights go by. Ethan chatted in his own way, asking simple, sometimes offbeat questions, which the man answered with unexpected patience. When they arrived in the upscale neighborhood, the contrast was striking. The gate opened onto a wide driveway lined with illuminated trees, leading to an elegant stone house. The beggar looked down, uneasy. You don't understand, he whispered to Richard as he got out of the car. You're playing with fire. If you only knew. Then tell me, Richard replied, his eyes fixed on him. The man stiffened. His face hardened, but in his eyes, Richard read a deep, almost animal fear. One day you might regret letting me into your home, he said quietly. Because I'm not who you think I am. Richard stood there frozen. The secret he guessed behind those words was beginning to worry him more than he cared to admit. The entrance to the Coleman mansion shone under the crystal chandeliers. The contrast with the musician's frail figure, his worn clothes and battered boots was almost violent. Ethan, carefree, pulled him by the hand into the living room, as if he had always known him. Richard, meanwhile, followed closely, torn between concern and curiosity. He had invited this man to understand, but already, the warning from earlier was echoing in his head, you might regret letting me in. Sitting in an armchair, the stranger absent-mindedly stroked the strings of his guitar. Richard sat down opposite him. You said I didn't know who you really were. So tell me. A long silence fell. The man sighed, looked down, then whispered. My name is Michael Harris. The name sounded familiar, but Richard couldn't place it. Michael seemed to sense his confusion and added. You don't remember, but at the time, there was a lot of talk about me in the newspapers. He finally raised his eyes to Richard, shining with a dark light. I was a policeman. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Policeman? Michael nodded. 17 years in the NYPD. I was respected. But one mistake, one choice, destroyed everything. His voice broke, and he looked away. I covered up for a corrupt colleague. I thought I was protecting my career, protecting my family. In truth, I destroyed both. When everything broke, I lost my badge, my wife left me, and I became a ghost. Richard was speechless. The man he had admired as his savior carried a burden of shame far heavier than he had imagined. "So yes," Michael continued in a trembling voice, "I got you out of that car. But after that, I lost the right to be a hero." Ethan sat on the floor, watching intently. Then he walked over and placed a hand on the guitar. "For me, you are a hero." The silence thickened. Michael's eyes misted over. Richard felt a lump in his throat. His son had just broken the chains of 20 years of guilt in one sentence. But a certainty also dawned on him: if Michael had been trapped by a lie or by a corrupt system, then perhaps the truth remained to be discovered. The next day, Richard couldn't concentrate on his usual business. Michael's words echoed in his mind, and a haunting question tormented him: what was this mistake that had destroyed his life? Using his influence and contacts within the police, Richard quietly launched an investigation into Michael Harris. He wanted facts, not rumors, and above all, to understand why his savior had ended up on the streets despite his respectable past. Leafing through the reports and archives, Richard discovered disturbing details. Michael had been implicated in an internal corruption case. But contrary to what rumors suggested, he had never covered up for a colleague out of ambition. On the contrary, he had tried to expose a network of corrupt police officers, and had been betrayed by those he trusted. Richard felt a mixture of anger and guilt. His friend, his savior, had been punished for doing the right thing. For years, Michael's reputation had been artificially destroyed, and no one had lifted a finger to defend him. All this time, Richard murmured quietly, "He paid for our inaction." There were still gray areas, particularly concerning the disappearance of Michael's wife and the fate of his daughter. But a thread was beginning to emerge: Michael was not just a man broken by life, he was a man betrayed by a corrupt system, reduced to the streets for having wanted to do what was right. Richard felt a new resolve rise within him. He had to right this wrong, not only for Michael, but also for Ethan, who had just learned at his side that a true hero was not one who possessed money, but one who acted with courage and integrity, even at the cost of his own life. He knew that when the time came, Michael would have to face his past, but he would no longer be alone. And this time, Richard would be by his side, ready to confront the system that had destroyed him. A few weeks later, Michael Harris walked the streets of Manhattan with a mixture of caution and newfound confidence. He was no longer the beggar Richard and Ethan had encountered, but not yet completely the man he had once been. Each step represented a victory over years of loneliness and shame. Thanks to Richard, he found a simple but comfortable place to live and was able to get his guitar back into his own hands in a personal studio. Ethan often came to see him, laughing and dancing around him, transforming every note into a burst of joy. Richard, meanwhile, quietly ensured that Michael had access to the right resources, police contacts to restore his reputation, job opportunities, and psychological support to overcome his trauma. One afternoon, Michael was playing to a small audience at a cafe Richard had discreetly funded. Ethan, sitting in the front row, was clapping enthusiastically, his eyes shining with pride. Michael looked up and saw Richard in the shadows, a faint smile on his lips. "You see," murmured Richard, "there is always a way to be reborn." Michael nodded, his throat tight with emotion. This wasn't just a material rebirth, but a reconstruction of the soul. He had regained his honor, his dignity, and, above all, a family of his heart in Richard and Ethan. Their bond, born from a rescue 20 years ago and rekindled by an unexpected coincidence, had now transformed 3 lives. Michael was no longer alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that life, despite its hard knocks, could still offer miracles. Ethan, jumping from his seat to join Michael on stage, called out, "You are my hero." Michael smiled, his heart full, as Richard watched him. In the child's eyes, he saw the purity of gratitude and admiration, and understood that sometimes saving someone meant more than money or power, it meant giving a second lease on life to those who had lost it. And that evening, in a bright Manhattan cafe, 3 shattered lives had finally found each other and were rebuilding a future filled with hope.